Hello and welcome to the first video lecture of Anatomy and Physiology 2. This is Professor Jay Kupke. If you had me in the past for A&P 1, you kind of know me, or at least if you took it online, you know me as an online instructor. Some of you might have had me actually in class, but if you had me before, you kind of know how I lecture. You're familiar with how I teach the course. Those of you that didn't have me, there's going to be a little bit of a learning curve. Every instructor is a little bit different on how they present the information and what their expectations are. So um, it'll take a couple weeks for you to get adjusted, but always feel free to reach out to me. Ask me any questions you might have about the course and my expectations. And if you need some advice, I'm always willing to give you advice. And that's what I want to start off this video and give you just a little bit of advice on how to go about watching the lectures, what you should be doing during the lectures, what you could be getting done while you watch the lectures. First and foremost, these lecture videos and the accompanying PowerPoint are your number one resources. I try to cover everything you need to know in these PowerPoints and videos. Everything else is used to help you. All right, they're supplement. Now, some of them are assignments that you're going to get a grade for, like the labeling assignments, the virtual labs, if you're taking it fully online, the discussion boards. Everything is meant to supplement and help you understand the material that's presented in these lectures. Some people are really good at studying PowerPoints. Some people don't know how to study a PowerPoint. So it's up to you to kind of figure that out because every student's a little different. And I've been doing this long enough, and I know that everyone has different methods that work for them. But these are your number one resources. So that being said, take these video lectures very seriously. Try to remove any kind of distractions. Put your phones away. Try to go into a quiet room. Maybe even get a pair of headphones so you can drown out all the other distractions in the room. But you should be more active during these than just watching them. In a perfect world, I would recommend you print the PowerPoints. I know a lot of students won't do that, but I think it's very useful to have a hard copy of the PowerPoint. If not, I know some students annotate on their computers or iPads, take little notes. I know that's a very good technique, but you should be writing stuff down. Many of my PowerPoint slides have very little text, and I just sit back and explain the figure. So if you're not writing things down, you're going to miss some important material because you're not going to remember everything. You got to write stuff down, whether it's just jotting notes down or whether you have the PowerPoint and you're taking notes on the PowerPoint slide. So that's the first advice. Number two, you can get a lot of the other stuff done while you watch the lectures. So I have study guides / guided notes. Those can be done during the lecture. And then when you're done watching these lectures, you have those available to study. Same is true for any kind of labeling activity. The endocrine system really has like one picture where you have to know where endocrine organs are located. You can get that done when we get to that picture at the end of this PowerPoint. When we move on to things like the heart, there's multiple pictures. But if you have that in front of you while you're watching the lectures, you can get all that labeling done during the lectures. All right, so that's my advice. Again, it's one thing to watch the lectures, but it's another thing to actually take advantage of them and learn from them. The more you can get from the lectures, the less you got to study. And then these lectures are always available. So, I think it's a very good habit to rewatch the lectures after you've studied the material. Because the first time through a lecture, quote unquote, you know nothing. And then you study and you learn more. And then if you go back and watch these lectures a second time or a third time or a fourth time, you'll pick up little details that you didn't pick up the first time. All right? So that's my advice. This chapter is called Functional Organization of the Endocrine System. Now, some books cover the endocrine system in one chapter. This book covers it in 2 chapters. So chapter 17 and chapter 18. Now, this chapter, we're not really going to be getting into the actual endocrine organs and their hormones and what those hormones do. We do that in chapter 18. In this chapter, we just kind of learn a little bit about the endocrine system, but we're not going to get into the actual glands. I've cut this chapter down quite a bit, so it's a pretty short PowerPoint. In fact, I'm probably only going to make one video that covers this chapter, whereas other chapters, I usually do multiple videos to cover the material. So what I would recommend is when you're done with this chapter and this video, go right into chapter 18. Because technically those 2 chapters are really one chapter in my mind. It's the endocrine system. But this first chapter is going to go over some kind of introductory principles of the endocrine system. What I like to do is start with a list of topics. You're going to realize that a lot of A&P2 chapters are pretty long, but you can break them down into small, more manageable pieces, if you will. That way you don't feel completely overwhelmed. And if you can learn a few of the topics, you get a little confident. You gain a little bit of momentum, and you feel like you can handle it. It's kind of like learning, the skeleton. When you hear that there's 206 bones, that can be a little overwhelming. But if you sit down and let's say you just work on the skull for a day and you work really hard on that skull, next thing you know, you feel pretty confident that you can learn the rest of the bones. So I want you to think about doing that this semester. And that's why I did these topics. And you can kind of organize your studying. You'll know kind of what topics you need to work harder on. So this first slide always goes over the topics we're going to be doing. So the first thing is we're going to compare the endocrine system with the nervous system. Nervous system we learned about in A&P1, and we start with the endocrine system in A&P2. Now these 2 systems work together to control or regulate everything in the body, right? If you think of any organ in your body, there's a good chance that there's a nervous system controller, and then there might be a hormone or multiple hormones that do something to that organ. So it makes sense to do these 2 systems back to back. But we're going to look at what makes them different. All right. So they both together kind of regulate and control all the other systems. But what's the difference between the 2? Then we're going to get into kind of how we classify hormones. There's a few different ways we do this, and one way is based on their solubility. So what that means is, are they water soluble? All right, and they like to be in water, and they kind of dissolve in the water, or are they lipid soluble? And based on that difference, they function different. So that'll lead us directly into how a lipid hormone works versus a water-soluble hormone. Based on that difference, their mechanism of how they work is slightly different. Then we're going to get in another way of classifying hormones, and that's based on where they have to go. So hormones need to go to their targets. A target is an organ or cell that responds to that hormone. So sometimes those targets are very distant. So those hormones have to go into the bloodstream to get there. Other targets are very close. So the hormone might not even have to enter the bloodstream to get to its target. Then we're going to get into how hormones are controlled a little bit. So we've heard about positive and negative feedback in the past, way back probably chapter 1 of A&P1. But we're going to apply positive and negative feedback to hormone secretion. And that'll be a good reminder and a review of what negative versus positive feedback means. And then finally, we're just going to go over and locate the major endocrine organs, and that's going to transition us right into chapter 18, where we go through each organ, learn the hormones that it produces, and learn what those hormones do. Okay, so let's begin. This is a table just comparing some properties of the two major controlling systems. So in this column, we're going to go over how the nervous system works. In this column, we go over how the endocrine system works. So they both use some sort of mediator molecule, or you might call that, a chemical messenger, if you will. The idea is you've got one organ controlling another organ. In the nervous system, you might think of, the brain controlling a muscle. In the endocrine system, it's a gland controlling a target. And they use chemicals. And these chemical or mediator molecules are neurotransmitters when we're dealing with the nervous system, and hormones when we're dealing with the endocrine system. Neurotransmitters, if you remember, are molecules such as acetylcholine, norepinephrine, serotonin. You might have heard of glutamate and GABA. Those are all neurotransmitters. Hormones, again, we're going to get into a whole bunch of those, but you've probably heard of insulin before and epinephrine before. So one system uses neurotransmitters, the other uses hormones. The site of mediator action. So basically, where does that mediator go? Well, the neurotransmitter crosses a synapse, right? A synapse is the connection between a neuron and the target. If you remember from A&P1, you learned about a neuromuscular junction, which was the junction between a neuron and a skeletal muscle. So that's where that neurotransmitter functions, at that little synapse or connection. Hormone, they typically are going to go distant. Now, not all. There's some that stay kind of local, but all the ones we're going to learn about have to go to a distant target. And in order to get to that distant target, they need to go into the bloodstream. So most hormones are going to enter the bloodstream. Now, notice the target cells must have receptors, right? So you got to have a receptor for that hormone or for that neurotransmitter. The target cells, so basically what does the nervous system control? It can control all different kinds of muscle. Smooth muscle, it might control, how food is moving down your GI tract, or it might control the diameter of your airway by controlling smooth muscle. It can influence your heart. So we've got neurons and nerves that can speed up your heart or slow down your heart. Stimulates skeletal muscle contraction. We learned about that in A&P1. It can control glands like sweat glands, and it can control other neurons. So that looks like that's almost everything. Endocrine system can control all kinds of cells throughout the body. It doesn't influence skeletal muscle, but we've got hormones that might influence your smooth muscle. We've got hormones such as epinephrine that might, affect your heart. And then it'll affect other cells. It might affect cells of your liver. Or you might have a hormone that influences cells of your kidneys. So endocrine system's functioning very broad as well as the nervous system. All right, time to onset of action. Basically, how fast does the nervous system work? It works in milliseconds, which is thousandths of a second. So nervous system is very fast, right? Just think about how fast you can contract your skeletal muscles. Those impulses get from your brain to your muscles in milliseconds. Endocrine system can function seconds to hours, or it might take even days before you see an effect. All right, so much slower as far as how they work. And then the duration is very brief when it comes to nervous system, right? You can stimulate a muscle, then it can relax. Whereas the endocrine system can the action can last for seconds or days. All right. So we need both systems to control organs. They're both super important for maintaining, homeostasis and how the internal environment of your body is working. All right, next thing, classifying hormones based on solubility. So again, you're either going to be lipid soluble or hydrophobic, which means you fear water, right? You don't like to be in water. Or you're hydrophilic, meaning you like water, so you're water soluble. If you're a lipid soluble hormone, you're probably a steroid. Steroids are cholesterol-based hormones. What that means is your body uses cholesterol as what we would call a precursor. All right, so your body will change that cholesterol in order to turn it into a steroid hormone. So typically when you hear steroids, you think of like testosterone, right? These anabolic steroids. But we've got a lot of hormones in the body that are classified as a steroid. And that's based on their chemical structure, which is very similar to cholesterol structure. So testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, aldosterone, and cortisol are all examples of steroid hormones, which are lipids. The thyroid hormones are not steroids, but they are lipid soluble. And when we get to the thyroid, we're going to learn that we can call these by kind of T3 and T4. They're both functioning very similarly, which we'll talk about in the next chapter. But the 3 and the 4 is in reference to how many iodine atoms are on the hormone. So we'll learn about how important iodine is for your thyroid. But triiodothyronine and thyroxine are both thyroid hormones, but they're lipid-soluble hormones. Most of all the other hormones, if they're not one of these, you can almost assume that they're water-soluble. These are typically either made from an amino acid, so kind of like what we do with cholesterol, we can turn it into a hormone. We can turn some amino acids into hormones. So epinephrine and norepinephrine are made from an amino acid called tyrosine. Melatonin is made from an amino acid called tryptophan. But those are all water soluble. Then we've got hormones that are made of multiple amino acids. So they're bigger. They need to be assembled, right? They need to be, you need to put many amino acids together to produce these hormones. Sometimes they're called peptides if they're kind of a smaller protein, or if they're bigger, we just refer to them as proteins. But these are all going to be water soluble. They're made from multiple amino acids. All right. So why do we need to know this? One is we're going to get to some of how they work, but also this might determine whether we can give these hormones as replacement therapy, and how can we give them. So one thing we run into with the endocrine system is deficiencies, right? You could have a deficiency in a hormone. If you think about, type 1 diabetes is a deficiency in insulin. There's people that have a deficiency in human growth hormone. There's people that have hypothyroidism, low thyroid hormones. Women that enter menopause have a deficiency in estrogen. Men can develop deficiencies in testosterone. Progesterone can be given as birth control. So a lot of these hormones we can give as therapy, as a drug. And the chemistry of the molecule, whether it's one of these or one of these, determines how you might be able to deliver it to someone, give it to someone. For example, all of these over here, all right, these proteins, you can't give them orally, or your stomach will digest them. Right? There's no such thing as an insulin pill. There's no such thing as a human growth hormone pill. Oxytocin, we do give a synthetic version. It's called Pitocin. It's not oral. You got to give it by IV. And that's because your digestive system will digest these proteins. Now, if you look over here, your digestive system doesn't digest steroids. So you can actually give these orally. You can give testosterone orally. You can give estrogen orally, progesterone, based on that chemistry. Thyroid hormones you can give orally. There are synthetic versions. Epinephrine, norepinephrine, you can't give that orally. You got to inject epinephrine. Melatonin, there is oral supplements of melatonin that people take maybe to help them sleep. Whether that melatonin gets absorbed in its active form or not is kind of another question. So classifying based on chemistry is kind of interesting because it determines whether you can give those hormones orally or do you have to inject them. All right. One other reason why we learn that is based on this solubility, they function a little differently. And we're going to be comparing lipid hormones to water-soluble hormones. First of all, how do they get to their target? So in this drawing, this is an endocrine cell. So this is a cell that's producing this lipid-soluble hormone, and then it goes into the bloodstream. All right, there it is. So this would be a lipid-soluble, so this could be any number of the steroids, or it could be one of the thyroid hormones. Goes into the bloodstream. Because it's lipid-soluble and hydrophobic, it does not like to be in water. And blood is 91% water. So that's a problem. So the one thing that it needs here, you'll notice it's going to get grabbed onto by this little blue molecule, which is a transport or binding protein. So that's one major difference between lipid and water-soluble hormones. If you're water-soluble, you don't need this transporter because you're hydrophilic and you don't mind being in that water inside the bloodstream. So that's the first thing to point out. Number two, because it's a lipid, notice what happens. It comes off the transporter and it goes right through the plasma membrane of the target. This is the target cell. All right, so remember your plasma membrane is a phospholipid bilayer. So if you're a lipid, you can go through the lipid bilayer. So you can go right into the target, and then that's where you find your receptor. So in this case, they call this a nuclear receptor because it's in the nucleus. Sometimes they're out here. But if you're a lipid-soluble hormone, your receptors are inside of the target cell. They are intracellular. All right? And then what happens next is this kind of complex of the receptor and the hormone targets genes. All right, so it's going to alter genetic expression. What that means is that cell is going to produce different proteins based on turning on a new set of genes. All right, and then based on those new proteins, that cell is going to do something different. All right, so that's how lipid hormones work. So keep that in mind when we start getting into the water-soluble hormones. This is just another drawing. It's a little more complicated, but notice there's the hormone, goes through the membrane, finds its receptor, goes to the DNA in the nucleus. Here's DNA in the nucleus. Alters genetic expression. So now you've got different genes being turned on, which ultimately results in a new protein. All right, new proteins produced. Okay, this is a little bit of cell biology here, but if you remember, we make mRNA from a gene, and then we use that mRNA at the ribosomes to make new proteins. All right, so keep that in mind while we go over water-soluble hormones. So now we've got the endocrine cell producing a water-soluble hormone, maybe that's insulin, for example. It goes into the bloodstream, but notice it does not need a transporter. All right? It doesn't need any help in that blood because it's water-soluble. Then, because it's not a lipid, it can't get into that cell. it can't get in and get that cell to do anything. It can't cross the plasma membrane. So it has to find a receptor that's on the outside of the plasma membrane, or actually the receptor's in the membrane, but it can bind to it on the outside. All right? So that's different. Then, since it doesn't go in to the cell, it needs what we call a secondary messenger. Think of the hormone as the primary messenger, but it can't go in there, can't get into the cell. So it needs to trigger or activate or produce someone else, a secondary messenger. And one of the most common is known as cyclic AMP. This is just a common secondary messenger. There's a few other ones, but the key is you got to have a secondary messenger. Then what that secondary messenger does is it activates some enzymes that cause phosphorylation of proteins. So the proteins are already there. They just need to be basically turned on. Phosphorylation is attaching these little phosphate groups that will then activate the protein, and then the cell does something new. All right, so a little bit different than that lipid-soluble hormone. Here's again kind of a little more complicated drawing, but there's the hormone, right? They say like glucagon or prolactin, but it could be a number of them. There's the membrane receptor. Here's a bunch of things that happen inside the cell. We don't need to go into much detail here, but notice what happens. You produce a secondary messenger, which causes this enzyme, these protein kinases, to activate or deactivate existing proteins. So this cell isn't making new proteins, it's just turning proteins on or off. All right? So you might be sitting there right now saying, oh my gosh, why do we need to learn this? This AMP2 is diving into, cell stuff. It's just what we do. We talk about how these hormones work at the cellular level before we start getting into the actual hormones. All right. Next topic is just another way to classify. This is a little easier. So we're classifying based on where the hormone goes. Now, most hormones are going to circulate. All right, so they're going to go into the bloodstream. They're going to circulate throughout your bloodstream and then eventually go to their targets, which are distant from the endocrine cell that produced the hormone. All right, and again, that's going to be basically all the hormones we learn. There are, though, some hormones that don't go circulate, they stay local. So local hormones mean they stay in the same tissue and organ that produces the hormone. Then under that heading of local, we have either autocrine or paracrine hormones. Auto means same, right? That's what auto means. So the same cell that produces the hormone also can be the target of the hormone. All right. And there's a number of examples of this. Some of these occur in the immune system where you have an immune cell producing these hormones that kind of stimulate the same cell that produces it. Paracrine, the key is neighboring cells or nearby cells. So you've got a cell that produces a hormone and then stimulates a cell that's in the same tissue so it doesn't have to go into the bloodstream. An example here I like to give is histamine. Histamine causes inflammation. And when cells produce histamine, it causes inflammation in that same tissue. So like if you cut yourself, you don't want histamine to go, circulate, because then you'll get, inflammation throughout the entire body. You only want the inflammation to occur in that tissue that was damaged. So histamine acts as a paracrine hormone. Okay, next topic is negative versus positive feedback. Again, you learned about this in AMP1. Most hormones are controlled by negative feedback. So what that means is in order to prevent the overproduction of hormones, the hormone will go back to the original organs that cause the production and turn that production down. So we'll get more into this in the next chapter, trust me, but this shows us how most of our hormones work. You got a hypothalamus, all right, and we'll learn the importance of the hypothalamus in the next chapter. Quite often that hypothalamus stimulates the pituitary. So it kind of tells the pituitary to produce a hormone. Then that hormone goes and stimulates a target. That target will then produce a hormone that might have another target. All right, so it's almost like a chain reaction. Well, if this hormone gets too abundant, right, because you keep stimulating this target, the overabundance of this hormone causes a negative feedback and turns down this hypothalamus and pituitary production. All right, so it's a way to prevent, like I said, overproduction of the hormone. Positive feedback, only a few work this way. One example of positive feedback is normal labor, normal childbirth, where you don't want the hormone that's causing the contractions to go down. You want it to keep going up, and more of this hormone called oxytocin, because you're trying to get to an end, all right, which is delivery of the baby. So this represents positive feedback. Notice this positive, positive. So the more of this hormone that gets produced, the more it stimulates the hypothalamus and pituitary. So you'll keep getting more and more of this hormone. All right, so that's positive feedback. All right, last slide is just to go over the main endocrine organs. Now, keep in mind, almost every organ in your body produces a hormone, even the heart, even bones, even skin. We just can't put everyone in the endocrine system. So these are the organs or glands where, one of their most important jobs is to produce a hormone or many hormones. Now, some of these organs will do other things. So, for example, I think we know ovaries and testes will produce, an egg and sperm, but they also produce hormones. All right. So this is just to start identification. 3 glands are up in the brain, which you might have learned about in A&P1 when we studied the brain. You've got the hypothalamus. All right, and if you remember, that's part of the diencephalon. All right, so right there's the hypothalamus. Attached to the hypothalamus is the pituitary gland. There's your little pituitary gland. So it sticks down from the hypothalamus. The pineal gland is part of the epithalamus, and it kind of sticks off the back here. All right, when we move down into the neck, we see 2 glands. We have a thyroid gland, which is this bigger kind of almost butterfly-shaped gland. And then embedded in this thyroid, kind of sticking out the posterior side. This is the anterior side, but they're just showing, these 4 glands, but they usually can be seen in the back of the thyroid. Then we move down into the chest, and there's the thymus. Thymus sits directly above your heart. Then we move into the abdomen, and we can see the adrenal glands sitting on top of kidneys. Pancreas, which is going to be sitting just behind your stomach. So we'd have to look behind the stomach to see the pancreas. And then ovaries in the pelvic cavity of females, and testes located in the scrotum of males. All right? So we're going to get into all these glands, what hormones they produce, what do these hormones do in the next chapter. So I know this video was a little long, but at least we basically covered everything we needed to cover in one video. So now it's up to you to study this chapter a little bit. Again, if you have the time, I would move right into chapter 18 and start watching the videos that cover the glands and the hormones.